This is Dennis Raimondi with the Coffee League, found at thecoffeeleague.com. Follow me on Instagram at the Coffee League. My guest today, Jason Huffnagle. Jason is a freelance writer for Barista Magazine who has worked in coffee as a barista himself for a number of years, and recently took a trip throughout Europe, visiting cafes and all aspects of coffee. And this is something I'm particularly fascinated with because I'm newer to coffee. As I said, I'm a journalist approaching it, and I have done a lot of this with my wife, travel around the states and mostly Scandinavia, visiting cafes and roasters and learning as much about coffee and coffee culture as I can. And I was reading through his blog, Around the World in 80 Cups, and we're talking about Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin, Krakow, Copenhagen, Prague, to be just to name a few where he's explored coffee in those areas. So thank you so very much, Jason, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, of course, Dennis. My pleasure.
Right. And I'm going to guess a lot of our listeners travel, and when they travel, they're looking for good coffee. So this is a window into that. I want to ask, what, all right, you worked as a barista. How did it happen that you decided, hey, I'm going to travel to Europe, I'm going to travel around and visit the coffee culture and industry around Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis. Yeah, so to give you and your listeners a little background, my wife and I, we were living in Washington, D.C., working for the federal government, and I was also working at a coffee shop, a local spot in the Eastern Market, and we were given an opportunity to co-lead a abroad program for our alma mater, Westmont College, which is in Santa Barbara, California.
Oh, yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so we got to do the program, and as we were preparing for that, I was thinking, oh man, well, I'm going to be going to all these great cafes and shops. I just know it. That's how I operate. And my wife and I got talking about that, and it's like, oh, well, maybe I can do a blog. And I'm like, well, how about I just pitch this to a couple of like trade publications, coffee trade publications, and see if anyone's interested in running the story. And Barista Magazine was my top choice, and they got back to me quickly, and so I just was like, great, I'm gonna write about cafes, but at the same time, I'm going to fit it into sort of this structure where the major historic and cultural sites that are around that shop, mention those, and kind of give the traveler an idea of where they can get some coffee before or after they go to the British Museum, or after they see this memorial in Vienna or wherever it was.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, one of the things I do on my blog is I have recommendations in various cities around the world. Most of them are places all of them are places I've either gone directly myself or somebody I know and trust has gone. So I'm going to pick your brain after the show or at some point for that, because that's very important. You go to a place and you want to have a very good experience. Another area that has been of tremendous interest to me is coffee culture and how it's different from one country to the next. Did you notice a lot of that? I mean, you were everywhere from Edinburgh to Prague to Paris to Rome to Scandinavia. Uh, were there distinct and different cultures that surrounded coffee or coffee cafes from country to country?
Yeah, there definitely was, and I don't want to speak, en bloc about European coffee culture, because there seem to be some subtle variations between the countries and even the cities that I visited. But I would say, generally speaking, that coffee culture, Europeans have a greater sort of sense of service than their American counterparts. And I sort of touch on this in my finishing entry, my lessons learned entry for Around the World in 80 Days. But essentially, in America, when you go into a coffee shop, oftentimes the format is you you make your order, you pay for your coffee, and then you take a seat or you wait at the bar and then you wait there until the barista shouts your name or shouts your order out, whatever it may be. And I didn't encounter that in any of the shops I went to in Europe. It was there was this attention to who ordered it, what they looked like, where did they sit, and if you weren't at the bar, they knew if you were at the bar that it was your drink, and they gave it to you and said thank you. But if you sat down, they would oftentimes bring the beverage directly to you, and yet there were certainly cases where they gave you table numbers and there was more of a formalized structure. But there seemed to be sort of this attention to detail and this extra layer of hospitality. That doesn't quite exist in American cafes, and I could say that would be an area that we could, again, I'm speaking broadly here, but Americans, we could definitely improve on that
I had
hospitality element.
Yeah, a couple other questions. Did you find the European consumer of coffee more sophisticated than the American consumer? And I know that's a general term, but let's say the American consumer in a major city like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, as opposed to, say, Copenhagen, Paris, London.
Yeah, I think that people were more willing to take in the sort of the experience at the cafe, and perhaps in that sense you could say more sophisticated. So they knew what a pour over entailed and were willing to wait for it. They knew what to expect from a sort of a bar drink, an espresso drink. And then also, this may actually help Europeans understand what they're ordering. That menus at a lot of these cafes are much more simple. There are all these add-ons and different house-specific, crazy sort of espresso cocktails which is wonderful. I think that's really great and exciting. But it also allows for the customer to more easily navigate the options.
Right. I think it's a great point. I recently had Kenneth Nye on my show, and he owns 9th Street Cafe in New York. They're still independent. They have 5 locations, and he takes great pride in only having, I think, 5 or 6 items on his menu: hot coffee, cold coffee, espresso, and it's very simple. And if you don't like it, he's happy to suggest you go somewhere else in a nice way now. But I think that was a big part of it. And like I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in Scandinavia, and all the things you're saying, I have also noticed. One question I had, I believe one of the cities you went to was Rome. Is that right?
It is.
Now, in Italy, it's very different than, say, Scandinavia. In Sweden, they have fika, where they sit for an hour, have their coffee. In Italy, you basically go in, you have an espresso, very few things to choose from. I think they have cappuccino in the morning, but not in the afternoon. And you stand up, you have it, and you leave. But I'm also told that you have, and I haven't been in Italy to explore this yet. I think next year, but I'm curious if third wave coffee is having an impact in Italy, if they're starting to drink lighter roast, if they're starting to do pour over, things like that. And I'm wondering, they have such a long tradition of what they have, and they're not always so flexible. And I say that being an Italian American 100%. And I'm wondering what your experience was like in Rome with coffee.
Yeah, with Rome, you're totally right. There's a long-standing tradition of sort of the darker roast, the sort of ritual of coffee is well established, and I think as a result, as the Italian ritual is so well established that sort of a deviation from that, which I think third wave would be considered a deviation from that tradition. Italians are very reticent, very hesitant to adopt kind of the third wave approach, and including lighter roasted coffees. So that being said, though, I did find specifically in Rome, Faro Luminaries of Coffee is this wonderful cafe near the Borghese Museum of Art there, and it was very third wave. It felt very familiar. And it was lighter roasts, and they offered avocado toast at the time, I believe, and some other sort of like the traditional or traditionally third wave sort of stuff. So that was kind of fun. Now you don't necessarily travel around the world or in Europe or wherever to just have some of the same stuff that you're used to back home.
Right.
So I enjoyed the opportunity to try the more traditional Italian cafes just the same, but it was a nice welcome surprise at the same time to have.
Interesting. Starbucks is going to open some like coffee Disneyland in Milan or something like they did in Seattle, and I apparently a lot of older Italians are saying, "Geez, what is this?" Whereas younger people are ready to embrace it. And I wouldn't put this in the category of third wave. I don't know what category I'd put it in. But are you familiar with what the Starbucks is planning on doing in Italy, and how do you think the Italians will react?
I had heard that was happening. I don't really have my ear to the ground as far as who there is excited or not. But I would imagine that it would probably be mostly tourists visiting. Could be wrong. Maybe the Italians will embrace it. I doubt it.
Right. Well, in Seattle, they have one of these big Starbucks, and I went to it when I was out at the Seattle Coffee Expo, and it was mostly tourists. There weren't a lot of regulars from Seattle there, and I just found it was interesting but overwhelming. It's not a place I would go to on a regular basis to have a coffee or whatever. But I'm sure they had good quality, and they had pour over. They had the whole range. But it was really almost, I said coffee Disneyland. It was almost something like that. Not quite that big, but with lots of tourists, but not regular, what I would call coffee goers. So it's, there's a lot going on in coffee, and that's one of the things that's being done. I think they're even opening a place in New York. Jason, I wanted to ask you about a city that, to me, was a coffee mecca. I'd never been to a city quite like it in terms of coffee. Well, all of Scandinavia was amazing, but Copenhagen, I mean, there were so many good places, and the places that you listed, like Democratic Coffee, Riest, I had been to, and also Coffee Collective, which is probably the crown jewel, in my opinion, of Northern European coffee. Was there? What was your experience like in Copenhagen, and are there any other cities quite like that? Yeah.
I absolutely loved Copenhagen. It was a surprise to me. Not that I wasn't expecting to like it. I just wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. And there are lots of factors there. The coffee there is incredible. I mean, that I think is something that was a big factor. People carve out time for having coffee and hanging out in cafes and doing reading or talking with one another. It's all part of sort of the this thing called hygge, which is kind of a lifestyle of, if people aren't familiar, warmth and comfort and kind of a laid backness, and I think there's also a good element of hospitality and welcome associated with it as well. I love Copenhagen for sort of the lifestyle. Coffee is kind of bundled into that. The design of the shops themselves, I thought, were just impressive. And when I step into a cafe, one of the things that I pay attention to is customer flow, the flow of traffic. What about the bar space directs subconsciously in some cases, and I think the finer ones subconsciously direct. But what about the bar directs people down it from ordering it to waiting for their beverage, and that I mean almost. That wasn't an afterthought in Copenhagen. A lot of cafes I find myself in the United States, it's the bar space is just kind of set up the way it is because that's where the water and electrical hookups are. Which is very practical and makes sense. But the the design, and we're getting there. But I would say that the Danes have an excellent grasp on design and how that makes or breaks a space.
Right, that's fascinating. I was in a cafe in Minneapolis recently, and the gentleman that designed it, the owners, they said that they'd really given it a lot of thought. So around the bar space is where they had no outlets for electrical. And then around the periphery of the cafe, they did because they wanted to encourage conversation and talk and that type of activity near the bar space. And if people wanted to just sit by themselves on their computer, they could do that, but on the periphery. And one of the things I noticed where I've been in Europe and where I've been in the States, a lot of times people go to cafes in the States to be alone, to just work on their own. And you see that in Europe, but much more social in most, especially Northern Europe, where
Certainly.
people go and they go to talk and in some countries have a bun and discuss whatever and have their coffee. Uh, in your travels, were there a few places that really, cafes or areas that really stood out to you? I know that's a tough one because there's so many places, but a couple that were especially memorable.
Yeah, mostly because of the combined mission of the cafe called Cafe Bergson, which is in Oświęcim, Poland. And most people would know Oświęcim as it relates to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camps, which are on the outer edge of Oświęcim. But Cafe Bergson is an incredible cafe that, I mean, I loved their coffee. It was roasted by a man only a few towns over, and it was just delicious. And the cafe is focused on sort of an interfaith dialogue, and then also it's attached to, it's not inside of the only synagogue in town, but it's near the only still standing synagogue in the town, and it's an active synagogue, but it's and it's also a museum as well, and so it talks about the Jewish residents that used to live in Oświęcim and their families, and we often talk about the Holocaust and through these vast numbers, millions of people who were killed, 6 million Jews specifically, and this takes that number, and obviously it's a horrific number, but it puts names and faces to that, and really you see humanity, you see the human beings, and just the tragedy that their deaths are at a more personal level. But yeah, so that's the mission of the cafe and the museum there, and it's just, I think the space is remarkable too in the cafe, and it's very easy to be there, sit there, have conversations there, maybe as they relate to the exhibit you just saw at the museum. But you don't have to go through the museum to get into the cafe. So I just, off the top of my head, that's definitely one of the more remarkable, memorable experiences I had because of its uniqueness, because of its weight.
Right. Was there much of a difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, or similar? It seems to me, and I guess I'll ask you this question. It seems that Eastern Europe, Poland, places like that are the third wave coffee is exploding. I mean, the growth and all. Maybe they had less of a tradition. They're locked in less to a tradition like Italy or Spain or whatever, and they're open to whatever. But everything I'm seeing and hearing from Eastern Europe is very exciting in the development of coffee.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. The coffee scene in Prague, for example. Wow, like they have a coffee embassy there, and they invite people from around Europe and around the world to participate in different festivals or events, etc. Which is so neat. What a great place what a great thing for the industry to do to, from one, city to sort of establish themselves and get them kind of part of the greater global coffee community. Warsaw is one of my favorite cities, which, the exchange rate is very favorable to the US dollar. So that certainly helps. But people in Poland are so kind and willing to discuss their coffee and background and how they got into coffee. I think maybe even much more so than some other countries that I went to. So I just had a very, very positive experience with members of the coffee community I met in Eastern Europe. Bratislava, that was kind of a capital of Slovakia, kind of a place I didn't expect to find a third wave coffee shop, but oh my goodness, it was great coffee. I went back twice in like 2 hours. So right as I arrived in Bratislava, I went there, grabbed a macchiato, and then went and toured a little bit of the town. I'm sure I missed some, and then made it back in time so that I could jump on my bus. Right. Again, I didn't unfortunately get to stay there for very long, but yeah, I think you're totally right. Eastern Europe is quickly adopting sort of the third wave approach to coffee, and yeah, I mean, I guess you've got some countries like Italy that are well, they've got their own tradition, and right. So making maybe adopting is going to take a little bit longer, but yeah, it's fun.
Right.
Anyway,
I have an interview coming up with Agnieszka Rojo-Łaska. I'm pronouncing her name incorrectly, but she's I think she's Polish. She's from Eastern Europe. She's killing it. She's winning all the competitions. She's all over the world now. She's amazing, and I think in a lot of the competitions now, the Eastern Europeans, a lot of the Asians are really coming into it now. So it's quite exciting. I mean, it's a worldwide phenomenon, and it's amazing how certain people, certain cultures really take to it. Did you get up into Scandinavia at all, into Sweden or Norway or Finland, up in that area?
So while I was staying in Copenhagen, I did take an afternoon trip across the bridge to Malmo, Sweden, and I did have a cup of coffee there. It was quite good. I didn't get to visit or explore as much as I wanted to in Sweden, but it was lovely, and Malmo has been in the news a lot for a variety of reasons recently, but I found it. Despite the sort of grisly tales of people being attacked or whatever, I found that the people were nice, people were friendly, and I felt very safe.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Sweden and get up into Norway and all, and I feel much safer in any of those cities than I do in most other parts of the world, and the coffee culture quite amazing. But I think Copenhagen reflects the same types of culture and quality of coffee, as you mentioned. And for those folks that have never been to Copenhagen in the summer, go there. Everybody's on bicycles. It's amazing. And I would also recommend to come up to Sweden and Norway. I haven't been to Finland, but I've had some great coffee people on from Finland, and I'm looking forward to going to Helsinki. Now, coming back to the States, after this tour and going to all these places, what did you find? Did your enjoyment of coffee dwindle, or did you feel you were missing certain things? Or right in the States now, especially, I believe you're in Seattle.
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, you're in Los Angeles. Okay, you're in Los.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm in Iowa right now. The miracle of modern technology. So Los Angeles. I mean, I know in the last 5 or 6 years, the number of fabulous cafes has gone up dramatically, as it has in much of the country. How was it? Was it an adjustment coming back, or you found your favorite places and no problem?
I've definitely have found some favorite places. I think adjustment wise would be, maybe, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, changing over from sort of my expectation of service, like the European, being in Europe for 4 months, right, and traveling around, you sort of get this baseline or expectation for a certain level of service, and not that American service is awful, and we're just the worst at it. But it's different from the European service,
Right.
like I mentioned.
There's a lot more coffee to go in the States than there is in Europe, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's
Like
right.
people
Yeah.
come in and as a customer, so many people come in and I interviewed it was Dale Harris. He's the current world barista champ out of London, and he said,
Mm.
the job of a good barista is to really educate people. Even if 9 people out of 10 just want their coffee and run out and not talk, that 10% that want to interact, you have responsibility to interact with. But I think, like you
Mhm.
said, was my experience also that in America it's like a hit and run in a lot of places where you come in, get your coffee to go, you're out of there. Whereas in Europe, they go in and it's more the whole experience of being at the cafe. In Sweden, the word is fika, where they sit for an hour and they talk and they chit chat. Even the teenagers, it's a big part of their life, and it's wonderful. And I'm seeing more and more of that in the United States everywhere, as these cafes are really developing, and the people's refinement in terms of their understanding and appreciation of coffee is developing, and they're having that experience. But I think it'll always be both. There'll be people that just want it and go, and other people who really want to have a whole experience with it. So it's
Yeah, that's
good.
right. You're going to have those both kinds of customers, and neither is necessarily better than the other. But yeah, I think by and large, the American mindset is I'm heading somewhere, I want to boost,
Right,
so I'm going to stop in and grab something and go,
right,
and that's fine. And the generalizing, the European mindset seems to be a bit more, hey, I've got some time, let me spend it here and maybe chat with a friend or make a phone call or whatever, and I'll hang out for a while.
right.
And so those two different approaches lend for different opportunities
Right.
for baristas to interact with their customers.
Right. Jason, where can people go to read about your tales of travel and coffee? Do they go to Barista Magazine? You tell them exactly where they can find your writing.
Yeah, it's pardon me. It's Barista Magazine ran the series. My editor Ashley, she gave me a shot. I'd never written for a magazine before, so I'm grateful to her. But it's Barista Magazine online. It's online only. It's not in a print magazine. And the first entry was October of last year, and then my final sort of lessons learned entry was just published about a month ago.
And it's called Round the World in 80 Cups,
That's
Explores
correct.
European Coffee Culture. Maybe there'll be a sequel about Asia, Africa, South America. We'll see. And,
Oh,
and,
I
uh,
love that.
and by the way, it comes from there was a movie Around the World in 80 Days that won the Academy Award many years ago. And so
Right.
it's a great title, Round the World in 80 Cups. I'll have all that posted up. Jason, thank you so very much for your time. And I look forward to talking to you again. It's fascinating what you've done. And thank you so much for writing and sharing your experiences with everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for having me on. I appreciate it.